David Cay Johnston, everybody.
Hello, Kim.
Hi, how are you?
Well, pretty good, but I got to tell you, I got to fact check the guest who was just on. I don't
Oh,
know who Bill Mann is, but
okay.
the New York Post was never a suburban paper. It's published in Manhattan. It was never owned by Donald Trump. It was owned by a family and eventually came into the hands of Rupert Murdoch. And the story about shoplifters, which is probably true and has been reported in various places that are credible, was not about Macy's. It was about Bloomingdale's, a much more
Oh,
upscale department store, the one across the street roughly from Trump, a little bit off, but right near Trump Tower. So
facts
anyway,
matter. But you know what is interesting about that conversation is I found to be whether we should keep covering Trump stories, every little tidbit Trump, or whether it's time to just let it lie. But I feel like as a with my news background, people need to know they're not only are they interested in it, but every time the guy does something wrong, to me, it's like a slow building or a fast building case, evidence, piece by piece by piece, story by story. And the news person in me doesn't want to let it lie, although I understand the argument for, listen, he's no longer the president. Why are we harping on everything and covering everything? It just keeps his name in the news.
right.
But I'm just caught in this middle between really wanting to put these stories out there and also not wanting to further his image.
Well, Kim, I think we have an obligation as journalists to cover these developments. The reason you are seeing it nonstop, especially in the evenings at MSNBC and CNN, and ignored at Fox,
Yeah.
is largely about economics. The economics of television make it very inexpensive to have experts on, even paid experts. And I don't get paid for any of my appearances anywhere, TV or radio, by choice. But even with paid experts who do a terrific job, it's too much
Yeah.
in my view. We need to. There are lots of other things that need to be covered and paid attention to, and I am glad that we are Americans who pay attention are getting a very good education in how the criminal justice system is supposed to work, the principles underlying it, the nature of laws that we are failing to teach in public education, junior high and high school. But I'm with you that it's too much.
Yeah. I want to get to, speaking of journalism, this story that you broke that really it's very applicable to what's happening to today. But I would be remiss if I didn't really start us off talking about this new impeachment inquiry into President Biden that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is now ordering. And I want to get your take on what you think. I mean, clearly, as far as we've seen so far, they keep saying bombshell evidence is coming, and yet nothing ever materializes. They don't seem to have much evidence, so it seems to be political. The White House is already criticizing the move as extreme politics of the worst kind. What are you thinking?
Oh, this is in fact politics. I mean, this is Alice in Wonderland. It's impeachment first, facts later. As Ken Buck, the very conservative Republican congressman from Colorado, said the other day, the House should not be doing this because there's no evidence. There is exactly zero evidence of Joe Biden doing anything wrong. Has his son Hunter Biden done things wrong? Oh, that's eminently clear from the record. But there is no evidence of Trump. And remember, the Republicans had a witness who turned out to be a Chinese spy. They have another witness who turns out to be utterly unbelievable. So there is no evidence of anything that arises to being an impeachable offense. So why is Kevin McCarthy doing this? He has a 4-vote margin. He has half plus 4 votes. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, who strikes me as certifiable, Lauren Boebert, who somehow is a junior high school mean girl, who doesn't know anything. Astonishing.
That's so accurate, that
Both of
description.
those members of Congress
Yeah.
who say things that have no connection to facts we all should universally have as common knowledge. and a couple of other members will not approve any new federal spending unless there is an inquiry, an impeachment inquiry. And Kevin McCarthy knows that shutting down the government again would be a disaster for the Republicans. So interestingly, he did not say there would be a vote on an impeachment inquiry. Right. He said they would open an inquiry. He's trying to thread a needle here in dealing with the extremists who are really his bosses. It's not at this point on these issues his donors, the American public, the people who live around Bakersfield. It's the 4 votes held by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and he has to kowtow to them. And this is not going to go well for the Republicans, barring they're coming up with something. And, if Joe Biden took a bribe somewhere, then we should deal with that swiftly, forthrightly, and firmly. But there's absolutely no evidence of anything like that. There are a lot of people listening, I'm sure, who will say, oh, no, we know that. No, actually, we don't. Nobody has produced a shred of evidence, just unverified, naked claims that don't stand up.
I know this isn't the way it works. So I get that what I'm going to say is pie in the sky, but do you feel like, and I know an impeachment inquiry is just opening an investigation, but does it seem to you like it seems to me that there ought to be some type of threshold that someone has to meet before you open such an investigation, that you shouldn't be able to just willy-nilly open it for political reasons, that you have to have a certain, something, you have to meet some type of standard in order to do it?
Well, as a matter of what's in the Constitution, no, you can just open an impeachment inquiry because there's no standard set. As it was said during the Nixon impeachment, which, remember, he was never impeached because he resigned. Right. That vote would have been unanimous against him. But it's of the impeachments we've had, and I teach this to my students, we've had 18 impeachments. Most of them were federal judges. One was a senator. All of them involved very serious misconduct. A judge in Texas who would hire onto his staff, a federal judge, women who were in trouble about issues like keeping their children when they had husbands with resources who were going to take them away. And a condition of keeping their jobs was giving him sex in his chamber wherever he asked for it. A judge who literally waged war on the United States government during the Civil War while maintaining his United States government position as a judge. Those are the kind of people that we should be impeaching. Right. And you need to have evidence first if you want credibility. So the law and politics don't line up here, but this is a good example of a problem that's not good for the country. The Republicans don't have any governing principles anymore. They have sold their souls to Donald, joined the cult, and they have become pro-Russia, pro-authoritarian, taking away freedom, which they're always, remember, freedom fries from 22 years ago.
Of course, when we were mad at France.
Right. Anti-police, anti-military. What we're seeing is that there were no real principles there. There were some people who articulated them. Hopefully the Democrats will not end up in a situation like that. They have been actually articulating principles: higher wages for workers, fewer economic shocks for workers, lowering the costs of medicine, returning manufacturing as much as possible to the U.S., shifting to a less polluting economy. So this is not at all good, and I don't see any good outcomes from this.
I'm not happy. I feel awful about President Biden having to go through it, but I guess,
he's a big boy.
He's a big boy and he can handle it. So I've been in news for a long time, worked at KGO for more than 2 decades. And I will say that I never once was told what to say. Now, I was assigned stories. They would say, Kim, I need you to go out and cover whatever shooting, whatever political rally, whatever city council meeting, what have you. But my station, whether I was doing news or I was a talk show host fill-in or whatever I was, never said, don't say this, do say that, ever. You have a story that you broke a long time ago about the way the media covers news, how we cover it, why we cover it, and the ability for people to stick their fingers in the pie that really ought not to for various reasons. I
Well,
would lay the story out, but I think you could do it much better. So,
I have a very long piece that ran yesterday in the Detroit Free Press, which I worked for from June of 73 to June of 76, so 3 years. And shortly after I arrived in Lansing, Michigan to be an investigative reporter in the state capitol, I heard that there was going to be a challenge to the license of the only TV station in town, a CBS affiliate. And I thought, well, that's worth one paragraph, and I'll stop by the station and talk to the guy in charge for a few minutes and write a one paragraph item for a column we had. And I was locked into a windowless room for almost an hour, then brought into the office of this guy, Harold Gross, who proceeds to tell me, you will not write about my station. You are prohibited and forbidden to do so. And I just politely looked at him and said, Mr. Gross, that's up to the editors of the Detroit Free Press, not you. And realized immediately, wow, there's something going on here. Mm-hmm. And I find out in one day that every journalist in Lansing, Michigan, not just the locals, the people who work for the Detroit TV stations, and they all knew that Harold Gross was using news blackouts. I'm not going to cover you if I don't like you. Mm-hmm. And manipulations. He said he only wanted the mayor of Lansing on the air if his fly was unzipped. He only wanted other people in unflattering light. And that he sent his news director to tell a member of the city council when he was seeking a monopoly cable television franchise that if the guy didn't vote for Harold Gross, the owner, quote, we will ruin you. We will make it impossible for you to walk down the street and look anyone in the eye. We're that powerful. You do what we tell you to do. And so it took, another 6 weeks of work, but I had a huge story in the Detroit Free Press 50 years ago. I was 24 years old then. Lansing TV owner blacks out his foes. And on the 50th anniversary of this, plus a few days, I had this long piece in the Free Press about why this matters today. On broadcast, you must serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That's right. What the law says under the 1927 Radio Act. But cable, where we have Fox and on the internet, we have places like Max, Newsmax, I guess it's called, OANN, places that just make stuff up, that smear people. There is no regulation, just as there is not with print.
Yeah.
And so I went through the story of what happened here. I am the only journalist in America who has caused a broadcast chain to shut down and go out of business. Harold Gross hired the very best lawyers imaginable, and I describe how good they are in the article. And up against them was a lawyer, freshly minted, 24 years old, had never been in a courtroom, who beat them. But it took 11 years. It's just that the facts were so overwhelming. Everything I reported was proven at the Federal Communications Commission in hearings to be true, and a whole lot of stuff that I didn't report on either because it was tangential, I felt, or I didn't know about it. And this business was sold. I quoted the mayor of Lansing at the LA Times when I was working there in 1984, and this all ended. I went back to Lansing to write about it, and Mayor Jerry Graves, who was one of the victims, said, so let me get this straight. The FCC found that Harold Gross did every single thing the Detroit Free Press accused him of and more, and he gets $48 million
to sell a station.
American Justice Grant. The stations were worth over $100 million. He had to sell at fire sale prices, but at least, in my view, the FCC should have just yanked his license and said, "You're out," and thrown him out the street. And for the stations themselves, he would have gotten some money, but nothing like the $48 million. The importance of this is that today we have huge numbers of people who distrust every news organization. Mm-hmm. Every day I see people saying, well, they just make it up at the New York Times. clearly these people don't read the New York Times, which is meticulously reported. Doesn't mean it's perfect. None of us are perfect. I'm sure you can look back at stories you covered KGO in San Francisco and go, oh, I didn't really understand that, or I didn't, I wish I'd heard this other person speak. We all have those experiences. That's why we call it the first rough draft of history.
Right.
But the New York Times, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, they are not in the business of making up stuff. And if you doubt that Fox makes stuff up, they just paid $787 million to settle a claim over this voting company they accused of all sorts of horrors. Another voting company has a case that's just as damning. And then there are individuals who Fox News did the same thing to and who are suing. And what's astonishing is we now have testimony and emails because of the first case, the one where the damages were paid, showing that Fox on-air people like Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, Judge Jeanine Pirro, they knew that what they were saying was false. They knew it, but they said it anyway. And this is a real challenge to our democracy. Our democracy depends on, in the view of the founders, reasoned and rational debate. That doesn't mean that we won't have people screaming at one another from time to time and whatnot, but it has to have some basis in fact and reality. And doing what Fox did in going after these two women poll workers in Atlanta, who the FBI came and told the mother of the other woman was her grown daughter,
right,
you need to move out of your house. They're going to kill you. Not
so
Fox
scary.
News, but people who believe this garbage. And she did. And it's the same as Harold Gross telling the city councilman, if you don't vote for, through his news director, if you don't vote for my cable TV franchise, we will ruin you. And this is a real problem. And it's bizarre to me that news organizations are unique in that they report these days. I mean, since my piece, which had a significant impact on changing the attitudes in the country about this, we report on our own foibles. When the Philadelphia Inquirer, a paper with such strict standards that they purchased the books they reviewed, they wouldn't take free books from publishers. That the Philadelphia Inquirer found out that its star political reporter got all these great stories because she was the mistress of the Democratic Party boss of South Philly. They did a 48,000 word
Wow.
self-investigation. When the New York Times, when I was working there, had Jason Blair, this young man who just made stuff up.
Yep.
The paper ran a 14,000 word Sunday front page self-expose of how they failed to catch him. The LA Times made this corrupt deal after the new owners of the paper hired a cereal company, a breakfast cereal company executive as publisher, who knew nothing about the ethics of newspapers. And he made a deal to share advertising revenue at something called the Staples Center in LA.
Right.
And the paper did a whole special section, 32,000 words, dissecting this corrupt deal, which led to the publisher leaving.
Yeah.
By the way, he was so utterly corrupt that he had custom-made furniture as put in the office of the publisher that cost the reports at the time. This was not in print, but I mean, the newsroom were over $100,000.
Wow.
And he had it removed, boxed up, and shipped to his new home in Hawaii, where he was going to be the president of the Mormon Temple in Honolulu.
Oh, Lord.
And so the public needs to distinguish between people who make money lying to you, Rupert Murdoch, OANN, etc. There are lots of studies and articles documenting falsehoods that aren't just mistakes or misunderstandings. These are clearly deliberate, intentional lies for profit from the serious work done by the Associated Press, Bloomberg, the Washington Post, the San Jose Mercury. I guess they now call it the Bay Area News Group, BANG.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people need to distinguish between those and understand that. Nora O'Donnell's CBS News at 6:30 in the evening is not what Fox is doing.
Right. big difference. Let's talk a little bit about consequences for this type of stuff, because I was thinking about in radio, every year I had to sign this agreement that I wouldn't engage in payola or
Mhm.
plugola, which is receiving money or goods or services for my endorsement, unless it's somehow sanctioned by the radio station, or receiving money to play certain things on the air, right? Whether that's audio cuts or whether that's music or whatever, they can't pay me to do it.
Right.
That's it. That's illegal. I get fired. I may get charged. I don't know what happens to me, but it's not good. So I had to sign a contract every year. Won't do it. What happens though in the news media, especially in television news media, if someone is, and it's not the same if you do it for money, but if you're doing it for, ideological reasons, or as the man you mentioned in Detroit, because you want power, because you think that you somehow have this powerful medium so you can hold it over everyone else and make everyone dance. Uh, what are the repercussions other than pulling a license? Why isn't it against the law?
Well, first of all, bribery and what's known as commercial bribery are against the law. Payola arose in the 1950s. There's a movie touches on this called American Hot Wax. Mm-hmm. Record producers, to get their songs played, would go to disc jockeys, and they would provide them with money, liquor, sometimes women, to get them to play
the golden age of radio.
Yes, and the folks who were into this early made a lot of money by corrupting the system, and it led to congressional hearings and the passage of a specific law about payola. At legitimate news organizations, you can't take anything. I have never in my life taken anything more than a cup of coffee or a glass of water from people. But when I got into the business in the mid-'60s, journalists did lots of things, and people at not first-rate news organizations still do things like a promotional trip. Hey, we're Hawaiian Airlines. We'll fly you to Hawaii and put you up in a hotel for a week, and you can write for whatever travel magazine about life in Hawaii. And as long as you disclose all that stuff, I don't have any particular trouble with it. But if you're writing a travel story for the New York Times or the LA Times, you're not allowed to take anything. You can't take a discount in the hotel room.
Right.
That doesn't mean the ethics are perfect. I mean, there are examples of, for example, some reporters I know who did very well in their careers because their spouse or the person they lived with worked in some field where they could feed them information about something, or keep stories out of the news. But that's not the norm. The norm is really high ethical standards. And I know that you won't be shocked to hear that I have seen in newsrooms where the lowliest clerk has authority. I once watched the Business Day, that's the business section of the New York Times, news clerk dress down the executive editor of the paper in front of 40 members of the staff, and he knew he had to take it, and we all knew she had the right to do it. I've literally seen people come to fisticuffs. They didn't actually throw punches, but they were set to go over a comma and how a comma affected the way a sentence read, making someone look bad. And I think people have an idea that these things go on every day.
Those are my favorite newsroom debates. That's why you get in there, because, it's so fun to debate these things and to, and even ethics to figure out what's right here. If someone has given you free tickets to the fair because they want you to go and get people to come to the fair, is that right? Are you going to be able to, even if it's just something as simple as the fair, go there and give a review that has nothing to do with making the people that gave you the tickets happy?
Right. And, Donald Trump got a Wall Street Journal reporter fired. The guy went on to become a very wealthy hedge funder. But he got him fired by tricking him into something that was actually approved by the Journal editors. But once it came out, it looked bad. It involved his father getting a ticket to go to a heavyweight boxing match. Donald tried to get the first reporter who got onto him in a serious way, the late Wayne Barrett, to get off him. He offered him a free multi-million-dollar apartment in Trump Tower, and Wayne had no interest. Donald repeatedly tried to compromise me, and one day at my home when I lived near Atlantic City, a messenger appeared with a framed photo of my middle son standing there with Donald, with a note written by Donald. It's on my son Andrew Drace's webpage. And I immediately realized he would use this to say that if I didn't take this picture and write what I told him to write, I was going to make him look bad in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I told the editors about it and said, we have to pay for the photo. We called around to PR, 3 different casino PR people at different casinos. They all agreed that the photo and everything was $100 value. So I wrote a check for $150 and delivered it to the Trump offices, and they refused it. So we then made a donation in honor of Donald Trump to the local charity that fed poor people in Atlantic City, and wrote him a letter about it so he couldn't use this against me. There are politicians who do things like that to compromise people. Mm-hmm. And if you get compromised, you're probably going to lose your job, and you should lose your job for not having good judgment. And this goes on all the time. When I was writing my book about the casino industry, Temples of Chance, I was invited one night to dinner with a couple of casino owners and a guy who ran one of the top 2 competing topless show companies in town. And suddenly I find myself sitting in the high roller banquette at one of the topless shows with the 2 lead dancers on each side of me, who then want to invite me back to their place.
No.
No, are you kidding?
That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. But compromising journalists is something corrupt people try to do all the time.
Yeah.
And we do need to recognize that that's why we have to have these high ethical barriers. And one of the ethics matter. Look at what's going on in the Supreme Court right now.
I think that's why journalists are so outraged, because we have the standard for ourselves, and then when we see a Supreme Court justice doing the things that are happening, and I don't know if you saw the Politico story about Ginny Thomas and the dark money and all this. I mean, it's like, it pales in comparison to anything we ever would have thought about doing.
Right. When the first Clarence Thomas story broke, which I think is about a year ago now, I said on this show, there will be a lot more. If this has come out, a lot more, and we now know there is a lot more. I don't think we're anywhere near the bottom of this. We know that Justice Alito has written a piece saying you have no right in Congress to tell us what to do. Basically saying I can be as corrupt as I want, and it's tough luck. I have a lifetime appointment.
Crazy.
Which is not true. It is not what the law or the Constitution says. You're violating your oath of office and your duty. And Clarence Thomas, who I've often said would make an excellent traffic court judge, which has offended some people who thought traffic tickets, has no business being on the Supreme Court. He was never qualified to begin with. It was the single biggest mistake made by George H.W. Bush when he was president. But we're seeing now that he and his wife, they're not just corrupt, they are actively soliciting payoffs. That's what the Politico piece describes. It doesn't say it in those words, but that's what it describes, actively soliciting. And there's a big difference, I think, between someone who passively receives something and someone who actively solicits. Right. They're really dangerous folks because they're completely out of control.
Yep. Yeah, that whole thing is frightening to me. Last question I'll ask you, and thank you for staying with us, is there's a new CNN poll that just came out, I saw. And some of the key things, takeaways from it, include that nearly half of registered voters asked, 46%, say any Republican presidential nominee would be a better choice than President Biden in 2024.
Yeah, this is an astonishing development. But first of all, I have to tell you, I'm not a fan of polls to begin with, and I don't trust polls because there's a pollster who lives here in Rochester, New York, which had a big history of polling businesses and still does, named John Geraci, who wrote a book called Poll, P-O-L-L, all caps, -arised, polarized. And one of the things he points out is that when calls are made, mostly the landlines, by pollsters, the response rate is between 1 in 100 and 1 in 200. So less than 1% of people are answering the pollster questions. That, he argues, inherently makes these polls unreliable. That's too small of a response rate. It used to be in the I did polling work when I was a teenager in my early 20s on the side, and the response rates were much higher. I think my memory is they were 25%, at least in the work that I did. Secondly, the Democrats don't know how to message. They just don't know how to message. I mean, we have rising real wages, especially for the bottom half. We have 3.5% unemployment. The inflation rate has fallen by half since June or July of 2022, when the peak was. Our economy is outperforming every other major country in the world. Lower inflation, faster job growth, more increase in income, and more increase in wages, even when you cut out the top where most of the wage growth has gone on, and I've written about a lot for the last 20 years. And people don't see that. And the other day, Joe Biden did push-ups with some little girls. They look to be about 8 years old.
Yeah.
Can you imagine Donald Trump doing push-ups?
No, I cannot.
Every weekend when he goes home to Delaware, Joe Biden and his Secret Service retinue get on bicycles, and he goes riding.
He's in shape.
He's
probably in better shape than I am.
He's in really good shape. He
Yeah.
does not walk well.
Yeah.
Well, I don't walk well. If you were following me, I have an injury from 52 years ago.
Yeah.
That as I get older and older limits my walking, and I look a little funny when I walk. But what does that have to do with my mental capacity and my judgment? Nothing whatsoever. And there's a constant drumbeat about the age of Biden. Excuse me, he's only 2.5 years older than Donald, who's 2.5 years older than me.
Yeah.
And that's a nonsense argument. And we have seen where Biden, recognizing he has these verbal tics because he stuttered as a child.
Yeah.
And everyone I've ever known, and you've probably known, whoever came stuttering, they have these little oddities, the wrong word pops up or a phrase.
Right.
But once you recognize that he has these verbal tics, he speaks eloquently and clearly.
Yeah.
And look at the successes he's having place after place after place.
Right.
The only really effective economic sanctions ever imposed by the United States are the ones being imposed right now on Putin, whose economy is just rapidly collapsing because he invaded Ukraine. So I think that Biden will be easily reelected no matter who the Republicans run, barring some unexpected development.
Yeah.
And I think that if the Republicans run Trump, they're going to suffer severely down ballot all over the place. And compounding this and complicating it to understand what's going on, of course, is this drive by the Republicans to essentially eliminate all abortions, even to save the life of the mother. And I've been there making that decision. So it's not something I speak about abstractly.
Yeah.
One of my first wife damn near died in childbirth and was in a position where I had to make the decision about what to do because she was all drugged up.
Yeah.
Their efforts we're seeing in some states to criminalize this. Women should be prosecuted if they have an abortion. Alabama wants to, I don't know if they've enacted it yet or they're working on it, a law that if you drive someone out of state to get an abortion, you've committed a crime. And that attack on freedom, along with the discussions that you can see going on in Republican circles about ending birth control, those cannot go well for the Republicans. It's just not possible. Look at the vote results in the states, Ohio and Nebraska and others that have had ballot measures and what's happened there. So I don't like polls.
It makes my blood boil. I can't be the only woman in America who doesn't want a group of people to have control over my destiny and how my life works out.
Before we go, I just want to make one suggestion to the listeners and viewers.
Yeah.
If you go to the New York Times today, where if you register, you can get 10 free articles a month and read the obituaries, there's an extraordinary long obituary about a New York City cop who was on the take in the 70s, as virtually all the New York City cops were, or certainly a large majority of them. And he was one of the 3 New York City cops who cooperated in exposing how corrupt the NYPD was. And he was then framed for a murder. And the obituary tells the story of how he didn't even look like the person who was accused of the killing. He was clearly framed by the NYPD and the county prosecutor because he exposed this wrongdoing. It's really a story I would encourage people to sit down and read to understand how people who are legitimately blowing the whistle, and there are lots of illegitimate whistleblowers, the risks and dangers they run. And being framed, a guy served, I think it was 32 years, because when he came up for parole and they say, well, you want to get parole, you've got to confess to the crime. And he said, I didn't commit the crime, so they won't let you out. He finally did when he was very old to get out. But judges who reviewed the case, tried to get him released and were stymied by other political forces. So just go to the New York Times website, type in the word obituary. You'll see the guy's name right away in today's obituaries. He's 92 years old when he died. And read that story and think about what that says about how corrupt some of our systems were or are.
Are is the active word there. David Cay Johnston, thank you for being on the Mark Thompson Show, coming on even though Mark isn't here. I appreciate your conversation. I love talking to you.
Take care. Next week, we'll talk to you from Sweden.
Ooh, that's exciting.
Global Investigative Journalism Conference.
Oh, I love it. Okay, we'll see you from Sweden next time. Bye.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.